I asked her for credit, she answered me nay. A custom like yours I can have any day, and it's no day never. No day never, no more, when I pay the world over. I'll get her no more.
This is a great pleasure for me to have Dan Mulhall with me, the ambassador to the United States from Ireland, who we met and brought on the show a couple of years ago, right, basically in the heat of the pandemic.
I like to think of Dublin as a walk through history. It's a bit like Boston in that sense. There's a lot of history that you can experience just by walking through the center of Dublin for half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. Will take you from O'Connell Street on the north side of the river up to St. Stephen's Green on the south side. And let's just start on O'Connell Street. On O'Connell Street, which used to be known as Sackville Street, O'Connell, of course, is the great Irish political leader of the 19th century, Daniel O'Connell. His statue is there on O'Connell Street. And he was a great political reformer, a liberal, a 19th century liberal who supported political reform, but political reform achieved through exclusively peaceful means. He was completely opposed to the use of violence because he had experienced the French Revolution and that turned him off. And he therefore decided that political change had to be brought about by exclusively peaceful means. So O'Connell should be well known in America as well because he was a fierce opponent of slavery. And in fact, he met with Frederick Douglass in Dublin in 1845, when Douglass had just come to Europe, having just published his autobiography and had to get away from the slave society that he was fleeing from. So he came to Ireland, spent about 5 months in Ireland, and among the people he met there was Daniel O'Connell. And O'Connell hugely influenced Douglass, and Douglass sometimes for the rest of his life referred to himself as the Black O'Connell, because he remembered that the people that enslaved him in Maryland in the early 19th century hated O'Connell because O'Connell was such a fierce opponent of slavery, and therefore Douglass thought that anyone that the people who enslaved me hate must be a man that I want to meet. So he went and met O'Connell and spoke at a rally with O'Connell in Dublin in 1845. So we start on O'Connell Street, but you start there not because of O'Connell, although that's an interesting story as well. But you start because you start at the General Post Office. And the General Post Office is where the Easter Rising of 1916 took place. Now, the Rising took place over 5 days in Dublin on the week after Easter of 1916. And this was an attempt by Irish nationalists to overthrow British rule in Ireland by force of arms. The effort was unsuccessful initially because the British brought in the heavy artillery and they reduced the centre of Dublin to rubble. The leaders of the Rising, who were all in the GPO that week, General Post Office that week, were all captured. They were tried, convicted, sentenced to death, and executed. And of course, W.B. Yeats has written a famous poem about the Easter Rising called Easter 1916, and it concludes with the lines, "We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excessive love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, MacDonagh and McBride, Connolly and Pearce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born." That was Yeats's way of saying that these people that he didn't agree with necessarily, he wouldn't have done what they did, but he had to admire their bravery, and he felt that their bravery and their sacrifice of their own lives in this effort to create an independent Ireland, that this would have a transformative effect on Irish public life. And indeed, he was quite right in that, because after the Easter Rising, you saw a war of independence and ultimately the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922. So we walk up O'Connell Street and we walk over the River Liffey, over O'Connell Bridge, up to the south side of the city. And that walk, in fact, Leopold Bloom, the main character in James Joyce's Ulysses, he walks that road up O'Connell Street, up towards Grafton Street. And then on the left-hand side is Trinity College, Dublin, which was the place where the Protestant community was educated for hundreds of years. It's now, of course, open to everyone. But initially, for example, even when I was growing up, if I wanted to go to Trinity College, I would have had to get permission from the local bishop as a Catholic to be able to go to Trinity College. That's all changed, of course, now, and probably 90% of those who go to Trinity these days are probably from a Catholic background, and it doesn't matter at all. But it did matter at one stage, and for most of the history of Trinity College. Trinity College was a bastion of Britishness in Ireland. And outside there are two statues, one of Henry Grattan, who was a great parliamentarian of the 19th century, and the other side is Edmund Burke, the great philosopher and political thinker, and the author of Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is one of the tenets of international conservatism, because Burke is the kind of the go-to person when it comes, well, at least traditionally the go-to person when it came to defining the nature of conservatism. And as you hit St. Stephen's Green, there's a big archway there, and that archway is actually a British imperial monument, because it is an arch that commemorates the Irish regiments that fought as part of the British Army in the Boer War in South Africa at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And if you walk around Stephen's Green, it's a lovely public park. There are memorials there to various figures from Irish history. There's a memorial to W.B. Yeats, for example. There's one to James Joyce. There is one to Constance Markievicz, who was the first woman ever to be elected to the British Parliament. She was an Irish Republican and never took her seat. There's a memorial to Theobald Wolfe Tone, who's regarded as the founding father of Irish nationalism, a late 19th century person who tried to get the French to invade Ireland in order to free Ireland from British rule, and was executed, was convicted and executed. Actually, he took his own life the night before he was due to be executed. But he's a great father figure, and there's a memorial to him there as well. And then you go down to the National Library, and there's a wonderful exhibition on the life and work of William Butler Yeats. And so you can sort of, if you like, walk through Irish history. And then I recommend that you go across Stephen's Green to the other side of the green, away from Grafton Street, and there you will come across the Museum of Literature Ireland, which is a museum devoted to Irish literature, but focusing mainly on James Joyce's Ulysses, the most famous Irish book of the 20th century. So that's my little. So I mean, the places I would visit would be, the National Library to see the Yeats exhibition, the National Gallery to see the paintings by Yeats's brother, Jack B. Yeats, who was a great modernist painter. The Museum of Literature Ireland.
What a wonderful, wonderful suggestions you're giving. Anyone who saw this could kind of just put down notes, and you could kind of visualize the way you described it, the way you'd be walking through Dublin. I know, having grown up in Philadelphia area, I took for granted the Liberty Bell, Independence Hall, these things. And people say, have you been there? Like, well, yeah, when I was a child in school or whatever. Is it the same for people in Dublin? I mean, do they go to these places or just kind of walk by them every day without thinking?
I think most people probably walk by them. You know, I mean, I mentioned that archway into Stephen's Green, which is, you know, there to commemorate the Irish involvement in the Boer War on the British side, actually, as it happens. So this is a kind of an imperial memorial. And I remember some years ago, I published a book about Dublin in the year 1900, and I mentioned that particular memorial. And a colleague of mine who was extremely well educated and, you know, steeped in Irish history and culture said to me, he said, I never realized that that memorial was actually to the Boer War. And this is someone who'd walked under that archway probably 1,000 times and had never realized that it was actually devoted to the memory of those who fought on the British side in the Boer War. You know, the Irish, I mean, many Irish nationalists were actually supporters of the Boer cause because they were quite happy to see the British Empire getting a hard time in South Africa at that time. I can remember the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising. I was a boy. I was maybe 11 or so years old. And I remember that anniversary. And I've been involved, of course, in the 100th anniversary because I was ambassador in London at that time. So I did a lot of stuff on the Easter Rising at that time. And the contrast was really quite stark in my view, because you go back 50 years to 1966, it was very hard to have a proper commemoration because there were still people around who could remember the events of 1916. So, and of course, many of the children of the people who were involved were still at that stage, you know, around the place. So it was very difficult to avoid hagiography, to avoid turning this thing into this kind of very solemn celebration of this kind of great event in history. Whereas I think for the 100th anniversary, none of those people are around anymore. Even the children of those who were involved in the Easter Rising have passed on, and you know, the grandchildren and even the great-grandchildren. So it's a different. So I found that in 2016, for the 100th anniversary and in the events of the last decade, when we've been commemorating the different stages of the move towards Irish independence, it was a much more relaxed atmosphere because people were willing to explore the issues, think about them, discuss them. They weren't emotionally engaged in the way that people were 50 years ago. And I think that's a much healthier place to be. And I now take the view that you should start commemorating things 100 years after the event, because if you commemorate things that are within living memory, it's complicated. Well, first of all, Irish Americans basically invented St. Patrick's Day, right? I mean, and I remember as a child, Patrick's Day was a rather boring affair because the parades were rather lifeless. And we always looked at New York and so on and said, oh, wow, isn't that wonderful? Wouldn't you love to be in New York for St. Patrick's Day walking down Fifth Avenue? I had the privilege as ambassador of being one of the people to lead the parade down Fifth Avenue on St. Patrick's Day, and I know how wonderful it was. But what's happened over the last, say, 20, 30 years is that we've started to take the parade idea seriously, and we've started to really put effort into it. And now the parade in Dublin is like Carnival in Rio. You know, you literally cannot take part in the parade unless you meet a certain standard. So you're talking about a really, you know, exciting, enjoyable spectacle now, you know, which we didn't have before. And that's really a legacy of the Irish having learned how to celebrate St. Patrick's Day from our American cousins, our Irish American cousins. So that weekend, apart from being St. Patrick's Day, is also the last weekend of what's called the Six Nations Rugby Championship. Now, Ireland has a lot of sports. We play, you know, with our own sports, Gaelic football, hurling, which are mainly played in the summer. We have soccer as well. But rugby has become a really major game in Ireland over the last, say, 30 so years, because rugby has become now a professional sport. When I started following rugby back in the 60s. It was a totally amateur sport, totally amateur. And they had a very strict amateur code. You know, basically the players turned up the day before, had one little training run, and then played the following day. So it was really a gentleman's kind of sport that they were engaged in. Now the players are super fit. They're the fitness levels of American footballers, and they have the, you know, the physical bulk and the physical strength and you know, conditioning that's now at the very highest level. So Ireland has become very strong at rugby in the last few years. And the way this Six Nations Championship works is that each of the countries plays the other one just once. Each team has 5 games. And the important thing to say about rugby is that the Irish rugby team represents the whole island of Ireland. So this is one of these areas where people of different political traditions in Ireland, nationalists, unions, all come together to support a single rugby team that represents the whole island of Ireland. And the players can come, and some of the players come from, you know, staunch Ulster Unionist backgrounds. You know, they regard themselves as British, but when they play rugby, they play for Ireland. They wear the green jersey.
I want to thank Dan Mulhall for taking the time to join me. You're always gracious, and this information you provided today, it was a lot of fun, and it was exciting to chat. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you.